Some films disturb us, some haunt us, and then there are films that leave scars. Men Behind the Sun is one of those latter ones. Released in 1988 by Hong Kong director T.F. Mao, Men Behind the Sun is one of the most controversial films ever made. A historical horror drama detailing the atrocities committed by Japan's infamous Unit 731 during World War II, it occupies a strange and uncomfortable space between historical documentation and pure cinematic exploitation. It's brutal, unrelenting, and utterly devoid of hope. Its legacy is something of a cinematic crime scene, both in content and its place in cinema history. It forces its audience to watch unspeakable cruelty while raising an unsettling question. Does this kind of extreme realism serve as a painful but necessary historical record? Or does it cross the line into exploitation, turning true human suffering into horror entertainment? To answer that, we need to dig into the film's historical foundations, its disturbing aesthetic, and the ethical minefield of turning real-life atrocities into extreme cinema. But before discussing those bigger issues, we must first confront the real-life nightmare the film depicts. Unit 731 was one of the darkest chapters in Japan's military history. Formed in the 1930s and operating until the end of World War II, this covert biological warfare division was responsible for some of the most inhumane experiments ever conducted. Prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians, but also Russians, Koreans, and even Allied POWs, were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, frostbite experiments, biological warfare testing, and countless other horrors. These weren't just war crimes, they were scientific perversions disguised as research. What makes Unit 731 particularly disturbing is that, unlike the atrocities of Nazi Germany, its crimes were deliberately hidden from history. At the end of the war, the US granted immunity to many of its doctors in exchange for their research. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, there were no grand legal reckonings, no justice, just silence. This silence is what Men Behind the Sun sought to break. But how do you depict something so monstrous without becoming monstrous yourself? Men Behind the Sun follows a group of young Japanese recruits assigned to Unit 731 near the end of World War II. Through their eyes, the audience is introduced to the nightmarish reality of the camp, where human life is treated as disposable in the name of scientific progress. The story revolves around Commander Shiro Ishii, a real-life historical figure who oversaw the atrocities. The film depicts his experiments in graphic detail, including the infamous frostbite test, where prisoners' limbs are exposed to sub-zero temperatures and then doused in hot water, causing their flesh to peel away. Other scenes show surgeries performed without anesthesia, prisoners used as test subjects for biological weapons, and a person being assaulted with a pressurized air chamber until their internal organs rupture. The film also introduces a group of young soldiers who struggle with their involvement in these horrors. One in particular begins to question the morality of what he is witnessing, but ultimately his resistance is crushed by the brutal machinery of war. The film's bleakest message is that evil does not always come from monsters. It comes from ordinary people who learn to dehumanize others. And in Men Behind the Sun, no one is spared from that lesson. Director T.F. Mao was known for his confrontational filmmaking. Before Men Behind the Sun, he had already directed Lost Souls, a bleak tale of human trafficking and survival. After Men Behind the Sun, he continued his focus on exposing historical atrocities with Black Sun, the Nanking Massacre in 1995. That was another film depicting the horrors of war crimes committed by the Japanese Imperial Army. With Men Behind the Sun, he walked a razor-thin line between historical recreation and horror cinema. On the one hand, the film presents itself as a serious war drama. It opens with real archival footage of World War II, setting an almost documentary-like tone. The characters, while dramatized, are largely based on real figures, and many of the torture sequences are pulled from survivor testimonies. It's then that the real horror begins. What sets Men Behind the Sun apart from films like Schindler's List or most mainstream Hollywood war films is its refusal to look away. This film doesn't imply cruelty, it shows it. Bodies split open, internal organs glisten under harsh lights, a child's lifeless body is tossed aside like trash. And that brings us to the most controversial aspect of this film, its unflinching use of explicit violence. Where is the line between necessary historical horror and cinematic exploitation? This is the question that haunts Men Behind the Sun. Many films depict war crimes, but few do so with such visceral brutality. Schindler's List is devastating, but it restrains itself, using emotion rather than pure shock. Come and See is harrowing, but it breaks up its horror through dreamlike surrealism. But Men Behind the Sun? It has no such filters. It presents historical atrocities in their most grotesque, unvarnished form. The result is a film that feels less like a dramatization and more like an autopsy. Cold, clinical, and horrifyingly real. But how real is too real? There are long-standing rumors that some of the film's most disturbing sequences involve real human remains. The infamous autopsy scene, where a child's corpse is dissected, has been claimed by some to feature an actual cadaver.
We just tell the police station we need a body for this. If anybody, anytime you find a body like this, let me know. And of course we have to ask for permission for the family.
The rat scene, where a group of rodents swarms over a live cat, was done with real animals, leading to accusations of animal cruelty. For his part, Mao insists that the cat was unharmed. But can we trust him? This all begs the question, at what point does historical realism become unethical? If a film crosses into actual cruelty, can it still claim to be an exposé? Or does it become complicit in the very horrors it seeks to condemn? Is this film a teaching tool, or does it simply desensitize its audience? Throughout film history, extreme depictions of violence and cruelty have been used to force audiences into confronting uncomfortable truths. But the line between historical reckoning and gratuitous suffering is razor thin. Men Behind the Sun is a perfect example of this paradox. A film meant to expose real atrocities, but often categorized alongside pure shock cinema. To better understand this, we need to compare it to two other deeply controversial films, Come and See and Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom, both films that, like Men Behind the Sun, do not flinch from the horrors of history. Come and See, directed by Elim Klimov, is one of the most emotionally devastating anti-war films ever made. Set during the Nazi invasion of Belarus, it follows a young boy who gradually loses his innocence as he witnesses the unimaginable cruelty of war. Yet, despite its harrowing imagery, Come and See never feels entirely exploitative. Its horrors are depicted through the boy's perspective, immersing the audience in a psychological nightmare rather than merely showcasing suffering. Its violence is presented not so much to shock, but to immerse viewers in the dehumanization of war. It's a film about trauma, not so much about spectacle. Salo, directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini, is an entirely different beast. Based on the writings of the Marquis de Sade, it transposes fascist brutality into an unrelenting series of grotesque abuses, designed to illustrate the complete moral degradation of power. Unlike Come and See, Salo revels in its cruelty. Not in a sadistic way, but in a calculated effort to make the audience feel as trapped and helpless as its victims. The film is difficult to watch, not just because of what it shows, but because it presents suffering as something cyclical, systemic, and inescapable. So, where does Men Behind the Sun fall on this spectrum? Unlike Come and See, it does not use abstraction or psychological horror to depict war crimes. It forces the audience to witness them directly. Unlike Salo, it does not function as an allegory, but rather as a recreation of actual historical atrocities. Yet its explicitness, its unrelenting cruelty, raises an uncomfortable question. Does it teach, or does it simply shock? There is an argument to be made that some events are so horrific they cannot and should not be sanitized for mass audiences. War crimes, genocide, state-sanctioned atrocities, these are not subjects that should be softened. In this regard, Men Behind the Sun feels essential. It refuses to allow history to fade into abstraction. It makes the viewer watch. But does that watching equate to learning or understanding? There is a psychological effect to extreme imagery. It can numb rather than educate. Repeated exposure to brutality, rather than instilling horror, can create detachment. Some viewers, instead of feeling the intended revulsion, may see Men Behind the Sun as another entry in the realm of extreme horror, no different from Cannibal Holocaust or Guinea Pig, Flower of Flesh and Blood. The ethical question, then, is whether the film's depiction of suffering achieves its intended purpose, or if it undermines itself by leaning so heavily on visceral horror. If audiences consume it for the spectacle rather than the history, does that make it a failure? Or does it simply prove that some stories are too horrifying to be told any other way? For his part, Mao always defended the film as a necessary confrontation with history. He argued that people needed to see the reality of Unit 731's crimes, not just hear about them in textbooks. But here's the problem. Audiences don't always consume films the way filmmakers intend. While some viewers saw Men Behind the Sun as an important historical document, others saw it as one of the most extreme films ever made, part of the same cinematic lineage as a Serbian film and Cannibal Ferox. This highlights the paradox of extreme cinema. When a film's shock value outweighs its message, does the message even still matter? Consider the way Salo is perceived today. Some see it as a deeply intellectual film about fascism, while others view it as an exercise in pure sadism. The same applies to Men Behind the Sun. It was meant as a warning, but for some, it became a badge of honor in the world of extreme horror fandom. And that raises another interesting question. Does turning history into extreme cinema trivialize it? If an audience watches Men Behind the Sun in the same way they watch Cannibal Holocaust, as just another shock piece, does it undermine its own purpose? Despite, or perhaps because of, its extreme nature, Men Behind the Sun left an undeniable mark on both horror and historical cinema. Its legacy extends beyond controversy, spawning sequels, unofficial follow-ups, and a lasting debate about the intersection of historical truth and exploitation. As mentioned earlier, Mao himself returned to similar material with Black Sun, the Nanking Massacre in 1995. That film was another grim historical horror focused on Japanese war crimes. While not a direct sequel to Men Behind the Sun, it carried the same spirit of unflinching brutality in its depiction of history. But the Men Behind the Sun name didn't end there. 2 direct sequels followed, though none matched the historical weight of the original. 1992's Men Behind the Sun 2, Laboratory of the Devil, and 1994's Men Behind the Sun 3, A Narrow Escape, were both helmed by Godfrey Ho, a director infamous for his cut-and-paste ninja movies. These sequels lean more into genre tropes, shifting from historical horror to outright exploitation, diluting the original's grim purpose. Mao condemned Ho's sequels, arguing they turned tragedy into spectacle. Yet their existence speaks to an uncomfortable truth. For some audiences, Men Behind the Sun was never about historical reflection. It was about the shock. Even beyond its sequels, the film's influence spread into the underground horror scene, often cited alongside Cannibal Holocaust, Salo, and Guinea Pig as one of the most extreme films ever made. Its disturbing imagery became a staple in shock cinema discourse, and its legacy remains polarizing. Was it a brutal necessity, or the beginning of its own exploitation machine? And so, we arrive at the end with the questions still unanswered. Men Behind the Sun was immediately controversial. It was banned in Australia, censored in the UK, and continues to be a divisive film decades after its release. Some historians and critics defend it as an important, if deeply uncomfortable, historical film. Others condemn it as exploitative propaganda. But perhaps Men Behind the Sun's greatest legacy is that it refuses to be ignored. Unlike Hollywood war dramas that soften history into digestible narratives, Men Behind the Sun forces its audience to witness the worst of humanity, with no redemption in sight. And maybe that's the point. Some crimes are so horrifying they can't be softened, and they shouldn't be softened. So is Men Behind the Sun a necessary evil, or a crime of its own? Only you can decide that. Ready to perform another cinematic postmortem on a classic flick? Then be sure to check out the link here on the screen. I'll see you over there.